This commercial-free knowledge presentation is supported by you.
This is a rice paddy in Korea, and you can see the hills behind me and the trees and the ridges, and this is the type of terrain that the Canadians fought over in Korea. At the end of 1951, the character of the Korean War changed completely. It went from open warfare to static warfare, a war of entrenched positions and massed artillery support, but it was no less bloody. For the Canadians who served here in 1952 and 53, the Korean War was a war of waiting, watching, and patrolling.
We were going down into the valley. We were almost there, and we saw these shadows coming up at us. Lieutenant Sykes turned to me, and he whispered, "There's 3 Chinese just ran across the path." It was like walking into a wall. You're going to maybe get hit with something any moment. You're as afraid as you'll ever be in your life because you think this is maybe death coming in the next couple of seconds.
Driving out of Seoul north towards the demilitarized zone, and what's clear in Korea is that they're still on a war footing. You can see barbed wire entanglements all along the river, there's guard posts, and you can see gun emplacements and bunkers all over the place. In military terms, Seoul is a very vulnerable city. It's only about 30 to 40 kilometers from North Korea, and therefore it could be hit by all sorts of weaponry. And it's sort of a strange contrast to see all this military equipment and fortifications living side by side with such a vibrant city. So we're still on the highway north of Seoul, but we're getting closer to the junction of the Han and the Imjin rivers, which means that the communists are about 1 kilometer away across the river. So you see a lot more military positions. And just over there, you'll see an embedded tank. I'm not going to point to it because I don't think they'd appreciate us filming them. But you can just look over my shoulder, and this is an example of what we're going to see from here on up to the DMZ. This is another example of military preparations in South Korea, and this is a tank block. You can see that it looks like an overpass, but in fact, it's got 2 columns. And in the event of a North Korean attack, they would blow the columns, and this giant slab of concrete would come right down. And of course, this would block the road, stopping all North Korean armor. We're now passing through the restricted zone, which is a higher level of military preparedness, and then we're going to go up into the demilitarized zone itself. And the area we're interested in are the hills that were captured by the Canadians in 51 and held through 1952 and 53. And what's remarkable is the South Koreans today are using exactly the same positions, the same locations as the Canadians held back in the Korean War. And it's amazing to me that the line has not moved forward in more than 50 years. Since the fall of 1951, all along the UN front, the Korean War has devolved into a stalemate. Hundreds of thousands of men on both sides dig in, fortify positions, and prepare for a different kind of war. In October 1952, 3 Canadian battalions are holding frontline positions north of the Saint-Michel River. And as they did almost a year before, Canadian troops once again move into positions on the strategically important Hill 355. The war had gone quite quiet in 1952. There had been very few major Chinese attacks on the Canadian positions. Even by October, for 10 months, everything had gone quite well. Casualties had mounted. There's patrolling and mortar shells, always some action. It wasn't until 3 weeks into October that the next major action took place. This is the infamous Hill 355. The honor of holding this position went to the Royal Canadian Regiment, and on about the 17th of October, they started to notice a lot more communist artillery fire and mortar fire coming in on their positions, and particularly ranging their positions, which is always a bad sign. The Chinese always used infiltration techniques, so they would try to find a weak point, and then of course they would plan it in advance. These attacks are very well planned. Both sides know the peace negotiations are going on, and I don't think either side wanted to risk too much. This was true of the Chinese. Gone were the days of the massive attacks across minefields. Now they were far more concerned about the preservation of their own lives. But they would determine where the weak points were, and they would often work at night even to remove mines and make pass-through minefields or cut barbed wire to try to get in. In this situation, the Chinese had infiltrated around the position and even dug advanced bunkers as jump-off positions so that they could move very quickly. The UN controlled the air, and they also had an advantage in artillery, so whatever the Chinese did, it had to be quick. So they had to get into your position right away. So they'd move up as many men as they could, maybe 100, 200 men into these positions, and once the artillery fire ended for them, they're through the wire.
I got halfway up the trench, and we had Chinese coming over the wall. Somebody started to fire, and I picked up fire with my Sten gun. Emptied that off. Then we just tossed them over the side of the trench.
Hundreds of Chinese attacked the Canadians with the intent of killing as many as possible. They overrun the forward platoons. Now the Canadians have no choice but to bring down artillery on their own positions. All along these hills, the artillery, the tanks, the mortars, everything is letting loose on the Chinese. So about 1 a.m. in the morning on the 23rd, the RCRs go back to their position and the artillery has done its job. And they've cleared out the Chinese. They made their point. They wanted to inflict some pain on the Canadians, and they had moved out. The Chinese raid on Hill 355 cost the 1st RCRs 35 wounded and 18 men killed. The costliest battle for the Canadians to date in Korea. The battle that took place on Hill 355 in October 1952 was a bloody nose for the Royal Canadian Regiment. But an attack on such a position should have been expected. 355 is the most important position in this sector, and the communists would dearly love to have a piece of it. Every sector had their own special piece, special linchpin. And within a month, the Canadians would get a taste of another infamous piece of the line, and it was called the hook. One of the problems with the Korean War is that the battles were all fought in a tight area of ridges and ravines that I can't tell apart. And it's very difficult, going from a map from 1950, to be absolutely positive you got the right positions. The other thing is that there's only limited access to a lot of these positions because most of them are in the DMZ or very close to it. So with the cooperation of the South Korean Army, we're going to try to get into there